Before we get into our case today, a huge thank you to our sponsor MagellanTV for supporting our channel again this week. And you know this means we're back with another amazing documentary recommendation from their platform. Murder on the Internet is one we recently watched and we have to share it with you all. Documentaries like this really interest us, and we've covered many a case on our channel where we've looked at fake profiles, webs of lies, and the dangers that can be hiding behind a screen. Murder on the Internet looks at many different cases with this as the focus. With first-hand interviews, police calls, CCTV and interrogation footage, there is a lot to digest, but it is a show to get stuck into. MagellanTV's true crime section is brilliant, but make no mistake, this isn't all they have on there. Whether you're into history, space, science, nature, MagellanTV have got you covered with tons to choose from, hours of content being uploaded every week, and curated playlists based on what you like. Click on the link in our description box, which takes you to try.magellantv.com/trulycriminal. And you can get a 30-day free trial to check out Murder on the Internet and then countless other documentaries after that. Thank you again to MagellanTV for supporting and sponsoring us today.
Garland, Texas, November 2011. 54-year-old Kelly Martin and her husband Don, like many, were decorating the family home, ready for the festive period. Don was a police officer and Kelly a teacher. They had been together since college and had 2 daughters, Lauren and Caitlin. While grabbing boxes down from the attic, Kelly missed a step on the ladder, tripping and falling. She instantly felt a twinge in her back. The pain was bad, but she got through the holidays hoping it was just a pulled muscle or a trapped nerve, and that it would pass. But when it became obvious it was far more than this, she made a trip to her doctor. This small misstep on the ladder had resulted in a herniated disc in her back. Physical therapy, painkillers, muscle relaxers weren't enough, and eventually her doctor recommended a fantastic neurosurgeon new to the area, Dr Christopher Duntsch. Incredibly well-respected, highly sought after and praised by many other doctors, it was a no-brainer to pay him a visit. Dr Duntsch put Kelly and Don at ease right away, saying it was no problem at all, a very routine surgery, likely no more than 45 minutes. In fact, it was about the simplest operation a neurosurgeon could perform, he said. "Have you ever had any bad outcomes or deaths on your surgeries?" Kelly asked. He replied, "No, knock on wood." And with this, her surgery was scheduled for March 2012. The day came around and Don waited patiently in the waiting area, but the 45 minutes Dr Duntsch said it would take would soon pass. Then it was an hour, then an hour and a half. It was almost at double the time now, and Don was starting to get worried. He asked one of the nurses to go and check, and about 20 minutes later, Dr Duntsch came out. He said the surgery went well and Kelly was moving around, but was in a lot of pain, so he upped the medicine. He said she may have to go up to the ICU and stay overnight, but she was going to be okay. Don was told he couldn't go and see his wife as they were still working on her, a phrase that sent a shiver down his spine. Don said something in his gut was telling him it was all off. He called Lauren and Caitlin and said they should come up. 2 hours later, Don and his daughters were still waiting around and panicking. They suddenly saw the ICU physician, Dr Duntsch, and the anesthesiologist walking towards them. The looks on their faces told the story before they even opened their mouths, the words no one wanted to hear. "We did everything we could." Kelly Martin had died. How had such a simple, routine operation gone so devastatingly wrong? Don said Dr Duntsch never said a word, not even looking at the 3 of them. They were told by the ICU physician that it had been a medical miscalculation. Records later showed that during the surgery her blood pressure had plummeted and she went a grey colour. As she regained consciousness after the surgery, she began to hit her legs, which had turned an odd colour with splotches on them. Kelly had become so agitated, the nurses had to sedate her. She never woke up. Don said it was pure misery. My world just ended right then and there. He started rocking back and forth, so enraged with emotion he almost lunged at them. "I knew something was wrong and I wanted to hurt him," he said of Dr Duntsch. Caitlin said it was like being in slow motion, and as they said their goodbyes to Kelly, Don asked for some scissors so he could keep a little piece of her hair. They all drove home in silence. The medical examiner confirmed that Kelly had bled to death internally after one of her arteries was completely sliced. Don, Lauren and Caitlin all had a terrible feeling they weren't getting the full story. Something about Duntsch was not sitting well with them and they wanted answers. But what had happened to Kelly Martin was sadly just the beginning, and soon a huge can of worms would start to open. But as always, sometimes you must go backwards slightly to move forwards. Born in 1971 in Montana, Christopher Daniel Duntsch had originally set his sights on playing football. One of his teammates remembered him as not being very good at following orders and struggling with the most basic of drills, but someone that came back every practice trying to get it right. He made multiple transfers and moved around so much that he was told this had taken away his eligibility to play professionally. He realised his football dream was over and suddenly made a drastic change. He abruptly switched to a career in medicine. In 1995, he received his undergraduate degree from the University of Memphis before getting his MD there too. He excelled in medical school to such a point that he was allowed to join the Alpha Omega Medical Honor Society and started working with Russian scientists on research programs, gaining $3 million in funding. He started his surgical residency at the University of Tennessee and was soon running 2 labs. He was described as a charming, smooth-talking and witty guy with a glowing 12-page resume. He had many people speaking highly of him and seeking him out. But despite all of his successes and accolades, things were slowly starting to unravel, and it was becoming clear that all was not as it appeared. His resume boasted that he had earned a doctorate in microbiology from the prestigious St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, but there was no such program running at the hospital at that time. He also claimed to have gotten his PhD from the University of Tennessee Health Center, but he appears in no yearbooks from the university during that period. The school declined to verify his claims, citing a federal privacy law. Since college, he had been a drug user and a big drinker, but during his residency was when his drug use started to escalate. He was frequently taking LSD, cocaine, and illegally getting his hands on prescription painkillers. His ex-girlfriend Megan initially thought that this was just something he did occasionally, but it was clearly not the case. After a full night of drug taking, drinking vodka and no sleep, Megan said he grabbed his scrubs and walked into work ready to talk to patients. She was horrified. His choice of drug was cocaine, although when he would come down after binges, he would rely on OxyContin, Xanax and alcohol. Many said he would start his days off with a vodka and orange juice and a line of cocaine. One of his friends would later talk about just how out of control his drug use was, and several nurses said they saw him taking cocaine right before he went into surgery. But Duntsch joked about it, calling them his neurostimulants, believing it made him better and more alert in theatre.
There's been LSD, there has been cocaine, there has been pills.
How long did this drug party, go on that night?
All night to the next day.
Okay, until the sun came up?
Well beyond the sun came up, because Chris had to go to work the next day, and he went.
After he was reported, he was asked to take a drugs test, which he refused to do. He was subsequently sent to an impaired physician program. In a deposition, slurring and not really concentrating, Duntsch pleaded the fifth over and over again when asked about using drugs whilst working with patients.
Have you ever been under the influence of cocaine while you were taking care of a patient?
I take the fifth, take the fifth, take the fifth, I take the fifth.
Despite the complaints, refusal to participate in tests, and after completing less than 100 surgeries, whereas it is typical for a resident to perform closer to 1,000, he was still allowed to finish his residency. In 2011, he was headhunted to join the Minimally Invasive Spine Institute in North Dallas with a $600,000 advance. Not long after, he was given surgical rights at the Baylor Regional Medical Center in Plano on a $50,000 a month salary. The recommendation that landed him the job had read, "Chris is extremely bright and possibly the hardest working person I have ever met," adding he had an excellent work ethic. For hospitals, surgeons are worth millions in revenue, on average about $2.5 million per year, and it is not uncommon to get operating privileges at other hospitals, hence the reason Duntsch was able to get a string of these across Dallas. Only a couple of months after he had finished his training, Duntsch met another surgeon called Dr. Randall Kirby, a man that would play a key role in this story. Kirby said the first conversation he had with Duntsch revolved around him telling him he was the best surgeon in Dallas, and the only one a patient could trust. He said he wanted to clean the town up, and was quite aggressive with his delivery. Kirby was taken aback with his level of arrogance, knowing how new he was to this game. Other doctors saw the same outbursts, but put his cockiness down to the fact he was just a really talented surgeon, and he knew it. Opinions soon changed, however, when the only surgery he actually performed at the Minimally Invasive Spine Institute resulted in him being asked to leave. After the surgery was done, he immediately went on a trip to Las Vegas to party, and left no one to look after his distressed patient. His drug use wasn't slowing down, and he would write many long emails to another ex-girlfriend and his surgical assistant Kimberly, saying some very unhinged things, likely due to intoxication. One email read in part, "I really am building an empire. Anyone close to me thinks that I likely am something between God, Einstein, and the Antichrist. Because how can I do everything I want and cross every discipline boundary like it's a playground and never lose? I am ready to leave the love and kindness and good and patience that I mix with everything else that I am and become a cold-blooded killer." In more emails, he referenced his drug and alcohol abuse. These emails were full of swearing, threats, and rambling and abusive language. The emails themselves are too long to read in full, but they are interesting and present a small insight into his mind, so we have linked them in the description box if anyone wants to take a closer look. In December 2011, shortly before Kelly Martin approached him, Christopher had operated twice on a man called Ken Fennell. He was his first patient in North Texas. The surgery didn't help fix his back pain, as Duntsch had operated in the wrong area, a mistake he admitted, but one he said he would correct with a second surgery. Ken, desperate to fix his pain, agreed. When Ken woke up the second time around, he described his legs as like a bonfire burning him. Something had gone wrong during the second surgery, but he had no idea what, and he left hospital relying heavily on a motorised wheelchair from that point on. Duntsch's next patient was Lee Passmore, and he was actually an investigator in the Collin County Medical Examiner's office. He had undergone back surgery once before, but his pain had come back. Without missing a beat, Lee's pain specialist recommended Dr. Duntsch. The surgery was booked right away. A vascular surgeon called Mark Hoyle assisted with the operation. Dr. Hoyle watched in horror as Duntsch began to cut out a ligament around the spinal cord that should never have been touched. Right away, Lee started bleeding so profusely, Hoyle said the operating room was like a lake of red. Duntsch not only left some hardware in Lee's spine, he also stripped the screw so it could not be moved. Unable to watch anymore, Dr. Hoyle said he blocked the incision area to try and stop Duntsch from carrying on. "We need to talk about this," he said, locking eyes with Duntsch. "That's dangerous, even that attitude is dangerous. I've done 5,000 of these and I've never seen this done before." For the arrogant and careless surgeon, it was not enough to stop him. Hoyle said he left the operating room and vowed to never work with the surgeon ever again. Lee Passmore did survive the ordeal, but lives with chronic pain and has a lot of trouble walking and balancing. The next patient to have his life irreparably changed was Barry Morgulov. Spending his life unloading trucks, his back was now in pain all the time. The only recommendation he got was Dr. Duntsch, but Barry wasn't sure, nervous about getting surgery, and he spent hours poring over reviews about him and all his awards and accolades. Barry set up a meeting with the surgeon and clicked with him right away. He said he felt calm seeing how confident Dr. Duntsch was. He said he was a very charming and disarming guy, a loving family man it seemed. Phenomenal, great guy, loved him, Barry said. In January 2012, Barry was wheeled into surgery. The vascular surgeon assisting Duntsch was none other than Dr. Randall Kirby. Dr. Kirby said of the operation, "In the spectrum of what a neurosurgeon does for a living, doing this procedure is probably the easiest thing that they do on a daily basis." Kirby watched as Duntsch went right in without using the proper tools, grabbing at things that he shouldn't have been, and haphazardly blundering around. Kirby argued with Duntsch before changing tack and politely offering to take over the surgery. But Duntsch insisted he knew what he was doing. Kirby left, but he was unable to shake this feeling that he had about Duntsch, and had had since the day he first met him. Barry woke up from the surgery in agony, a pain unlike anything he'd felt before. It would turn out that there were bone fragments that had been left in Barry's spinal canal. Another surgeon would later try and repair the damage, but Barry has to walk with a cane now, and his doctor said one day he will end up in a wheelchair. At one point, Barry was so depressed and sick that he contemplated taking his own life, believing it was the only way the mental and physical pain would end. Fortunately, his wife and children were able to pull him out of the dark place, and he began some intensive therapy. Duntsch's childhood friend and now roommate, Jerry Summers, then approached him to perform a surgery on his back too. He had a herniated disc. The pair would often go out partying together, and Jerry even had access to Duntsch's credit cards. To ask his good friend to do this simple surgery seemed like a given. The trust was already there, and Duntsch was often talking about how highly in demand he was. But for Jerry, the dream situation would quickly turn into a nightmare. In surgery, he damaged Jerry's vertebral artery, and the bleeding just wasn't stopping. 2 litres of blood was soon lost. Duntsch packed the area with so much anticoagulant that it squeezed Jerry's spine. When Jerry woke up, he said he couldn't feel anything. He had no sensation in either of his arms or legs and was now completely paralysed, and would later require 24/7, round-the-clock care. Lying in the ICU, knowing that he was never going to recover, he turned to his girlfriend and said, "Kill me, I want to die." Duntsch never once came to see his friend, see how he was, or even explain what had happened. In a depressed rage, Jerry told the nurses that Duntsch had been taking cocaine the night before he performed the surgery. He later admitted he had just made this up, but knowing his friend and his drug usage, he felt it was a fairly educated assumption. His claim was taken seriously and Duntsch was ordered to take a drugs test. The test would never happen, as Duntsch claimed he got lost on his way there. He did pass a separate psychological evaluation, and just 3 weeks later, he was allowed to start operating again, but was instructed to stick to minor procedures. But after this, we come back to Kelly Martin's case. She would be his next patient. After Kelly died, officials ordered Duntsch to take another drug test. This time, he took it. The first screening came back as showing it had been diluted with water, and the second, a few days later, was clean. Some while later, Lee, still struggling to work, was allowed to resign from his job at the Collin County Medical Examiner's office, but before he left, a fax came through that stopped him in his tracks. There were 2 names at the top of the first page, Kelly Martin and Dr Christopher Duntsch. He sat and read what happened to her, shocked at what he was seeing. The cogs started turning as he connected the dots between that and his own botched surgery. He went down a rabbit hole and found a few months that were not accounted for in Duntsch's educational history. He said you don't get to walk away from 2 to 3 years of medical training in the middle of an internship or a residency, get to take time off and be slotted directly in the position you left in, with no questions asked. Maybe that's how they do it in Tennessee, but according to my training, that's not how they do it here. Then it all just started to unravel. Administrators at the hospital put together a comprehensive review of all of Duntsch's cases, and each time the same thing had happened. Patterns were showing, and other surgeons were talking. Now someone was dead. This could not be ignored. After going through everything that had happened in that particular hospital alone, they determined he couldn't continue there. To the shock of the other surgeons and patients, the hospital did not fire him. Instead, they asked him to resign, remaining in good standing, with his last day being in April 2012. Through a letter, Baylor Plano said, "All areas of concern with regard to Christopher D. Duntsch have been closed. As of this date, there have been no summary or administrative restrictions or suspension of Duntsch's medical staff membership or clinical privileges during the time he has practiced at Baylor Regional Medical Center at Plano." The places that had asked him to leave chose to avoid the legalities of a potential wrongful termination and bad press of firing such a highly respected doctor, and instead let him quietly resign and move on with no repercussions. And as he technically left of his own choice, this meant that at least 2 facilities did not have to report him to a database run by the US Department of Health and Human Services. This database is supposed to log information about problem practitioners, warning potential employers about their histories. They also failed to report him to the Texas Medical Board. When some of his patients tried to sue him for malpractice, most of them found it virtually impossible to find attorneys willing to take on their cases. In 2003, Texas enacted tort reform, which reduced the amount of damages plaintiffs could win, with the number of malpractice payouts per year dropping by more than half. In July 2012, Duntsch moved right on to the Dallas Medical Center. The background check they briefly ran on him came back clean. In the same month he joined, Duntsch operated on 63-year-old Floella Brown, a banker looking forward to retirement. About 30 minutes into the surgery, the bleeding was so bad that Duntsch said he couldn't see her spine. "Why is it still bleeding?" he kept saying. After a few scary moments, it seemed Duntsch had got it under control, but nurses in the room were concerned. Although Floella woke up and seemed fine, early the following morning she lost consciousness as pressure was building up inside her brain for reasons that no one could work out. She was in critical condition and it wasn't looking good. While Floella lay in the intensive care unit, with doctors fighting to save her life, Duntsch was set to go into another surgery with 71-year-old Mary Eford. Mary was very active and loved working out, but back pain was stopping her from living her life. The surgery was very simple, easily mastered by most first-year residents. Before the surgery started, nurses spotted a hole in Duntsch's scrubs right at the back, showing he wasn't wearing underwear. One nurse, Kyle Kissinger, said he had seen the same hole for 3 straight days, and it was clear that Duntsch wasn't even changing his scrubs between surgeries. As he stared into Duntsch's eyes, he said he had pinpoint pupils and wasn't blinking. It was all very alarming. The surgery for Duntsch was more of the same. The operating room staff questioned why he seemed to be drilling into random areas of her back, carelessly and without paying any attention. Soon after the surgery on Mary started, Duntsch turned to Kyle and said he wanted to perform a procedure on Floella called a craniotomy. This involves cutting a hole in the skull to relieve pressure on the brain. Kyle was shocked and said Dallas Medical Center did not perform these, as they didn't have the proper equipment to be able to. Other people in the room were agreeing with what Kyle was saying, trying to talk him out of it. Unfortunately, he backed down. Floella was moved to another hospital, but she never regained consciousness, and her family withdrew her life support a few days later. A neurosurgeon was hired to review her case and death, and would later conclude that Duntsch had both pierced and blocked her vertebral artery with a misplaced screw. He also found that he had misdiagnosed the source of her pain in the first place and was operating in totally the wrong area. This had triggered a stroke, which had ultimately claimed her life. Mary Eford woke up from the surgery the same as the others before her, in total agony. She couldn't move her legs or feel her toes. Dr. Robert Henderson, another important person in this story, was called in to look at her case. He was an extremely talented Dallas spinal surgeon with 3 decades of experience. He pulled up her post-op x-rays and the first thing he said was, "Some kind of travesty occurred." Mary was pulled back into surgery the next day with Dr. Henderson operating. There were 3 holes in Mary's spinal column where Duntsch had tried and failed to insert several screws. One screw had hit the nerves that control one leg and the bladder. Dr. Henderson then discovered that Duntsch had amputated on one of her nerve roots, for reasons Henderson called inexplicable. The surgery had gone so badly and was so botched, Dr. Henderson wondered if Duntsch was some sort of imposter, dressing up and pretending to be a surgeon. He could think of no other reason why this had gone so wrong. Mary Eford now relies on a wheelchair. She has never regained mobility in her legs. She said one of her biggest loves was sewing. She used to do it all the time, but as she can't pick up her foot, she can't do this anymore. "Pain is really my life," she said. Dr. Henderson was horrified and took his findings to the hospital administrators, and he and Dr. Kirby both started sharing stories. Dr. Kirby had operating privileges at over 60 hospitals across Texas, and wherever he went, someone at some point would come up to him with a story about Dr. Duntsch. Thanks to the fuss the pair kicked up, hospital officials told Duntsch he would no longer be able to operate at Dallas Medical Center. However, yet again, he wasn't fired or suspended. He was allowed to leave quietly. People were going in for the most simple, routine and standard surgeries and procedures, and they were coming out worse than they went in. And in the case of Kelly Martin and Floella Brown, they weren't coming out at all. It had taken months and multiple catastrophic and fatal surgeries, but finally Dr Duntsch was reported to the State Medical Board. However, this was not the simple fix surgeons like Dr Henderson and Dr Kirby thought. It would take almost a whole year for the board to investigate, all the while Duntsch was operating elsewhere. Things went quiet for a little while, until December 2012. Dr Kirby was asked to assist with a woman called Jacqueline Troy. She had had neck surgery and was now battling a severe infection. Dr Kirby found that the surgeon who had operated on her had cut her vocal cords and one of her arteries. "Is it a guy named Christopher Duntsch?" he asked. He knew the answer already, and of course the answer was yes. Duntsch was finally reported to the National Practitioner Databank, but even after the report was filed, Dr Kirby found that another hospital had given him operating privileges. Although Duntsch didn't realise this, Jeff Glidewell would be his last patient. Jeff, always an outdoors-loving man, had had a motorbike accident years before, and his back and neck had never been the same. He had come across Duntsch in an advert that was showing the best neurosurgeons in the Dallas area.
It's a call that's telling me I'm here to serve. It's a need to make a difference in the world. 24 hours, day or night. Changing lives. Changing lives.
And hi again, everyone. Jim Knox along with Candace Kruger, and welcome back to another edition of the Best Docs Network, which of course features some of the best doctors in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Dr. Christopher Duntsch calls himself the best neurosurgeon in all of Dallas. He specializes in relieving back and neck pain.
Then they come back to me to discuss surgical options.
Despite everything going wrong for Duntsch's patients, it seemed he was still the talk of the town. As a superstitious man, Jeff saw 3 black cats on the way into the hospital and said his gut told him to turn around. Reassured by his wife, they carried on for the surgery. Hours later, Duntsch was nowhere to be found. 3 hours after the surgery was supposed to start, Duntsch finally turned up in a cab, claiming he had a flat tire. His jeans were frayed, he was sweaty and dishevelled, and Jeff said he didn't look at all ready for the surgery. His bad feeling grew, but he kissed his wife goodbye and went into the operating room. At this point, unbeknownst to Jeff, the State Medical Board had been investigating Duntsch for about 10 months. During the surgery, Duntsch thought that part of Jeff's neck muscle was a tumour and stopped operating on him halfway through. He cut into Jeff's vocal cords, punctured an artery, and cut a hole in his esophagus. Duntsch used a sponge to stop the bleeding and stitched Jeff back up, with the sponge still inside him. Duntsch came out and told Jeff's wife Robin he had found a tumour confirmed by a quick biopsy, and therefore he couldn't possibly carry on. But there was no tumour, and there had been no biopsy. Robin went in to see Jeff in the recovery room.
Oh, God.
Jeff was so distressed he couldn't swallow and breathlessly mumbled, "Where's the doctor? I can't move my arm or my leg. Something's wrong, what did he do to me?" Duntsch finally showed his face, and Jeff, now battling an infection as well, said, "I can't move my arms." Duntsch replied, "Well, I don't know what to tell you about that," before strolling off. None other than Dr. Randall Kirby was called in to correct the damage, and at this point he was quite literally losing his mind. How did this keep happening, and when was it going to end? On a scale of difficulty, this was about a 2 out of 10 procedure. He said this was not an operation that was performed. This was attempted murder. It was like a crazed maniac procedure. Dr. Kirby went directly to the Texas Medical Board, and Robin went to the police. The officer she spoke to said they didn't have the resources to file criminal charges against a doctor. She went back to Dr. Kirby, asking if she could contact the medical board too, and a statement was drafted. Jeff Glidewell would leave the hospital months later, partially paralysed and with only one vocal cord. He has nerve damage in one arm and can only eat small bites of food at a time. But Duntsch would again move elsewhere. In May 2013, Dr. Henderson and Dr. Kirby opened up their emails to find an invite to a Meet the New Specialist dinner. University General Hospital was throwing an event to welcome a new neurosurgeon joining their team, Dr. Christopher Duntsch. They simply couldn't believe it. This was Duntsch's third hospital in 18 months. Dr. Kirby said he picked up the phone right away and called the hospital to, in his words, raise holy hell. He then sent them a 6-page letter which read in part, "Let me be blunt. Christopher Duntsch, Texas Medical Board license number N8183, is an impaired physician, a sociopath, and must be stopped from practicing medicine." In the letter, Kirby told the hospital they could either address it and do something about it, or he would be calling every media outlet in Texas. With so much talk in the medical community and between family members, the stories were travelling fast. An article was published about him online referring to him as Dr. Death and quoted Dr. Kirby and all of his findings. Duntsch took to the comment section to threaten Dr. Kirby if he kept talking. But in this case, there was no such thing as bad publicity, because finally, in June 2013, Christopher Duntsch was suspended and ordered to stop operating.
A Plano neurosurgeon has his license suspended after the medical board says his negligence resulted in at least 2 patient deaths. Patients tried to get their medical records from Dr. Christopher Duntsch's office today, but they were turned away.
Yeah, well, Clarice, those frustrated patients were told by somebody on Dr. Duntsch's staff to show up here at his office between 4 and 5 o'clock this afternoon to pick up those medical records. Well, those patients showed up, but as you mentioned, they didn't walk away with anything. And so far, we know that 2 lawsuits have been filed and at least 3 more are on the way.
Carol McMillan, out of luck at Dr. Duntsch's office at the Texas Neurological Institute in Plano. Dr. Duntsch, seen here on Facebook, was scheduled to perform surgery on her tomorrow. On Wednesday, the Texas Medical Board issued a temporary suspension order of Duntsch's license because of imminent peril to public health and cited impairment by drugs or alcohol. Mary Eford claims in her lawsuit she has permanent nerve damage because of Dr. Duntsch's negligence.
Despite being on the maximum amount of narcotics, that she prayed to God to take her every single day. She cried every single day.
54-year-old Kelly Martin, mother of 2 and wife of a Garland police officer, died from massive bleeding and is patient number 2 cited in the suspension order. Duntsch has had surgical privileges at several North Texas hospitals, but most recently had them revoked at University General Hospital in Dallas.
A temporary suspension really doesn't refer to any specific time frame. It's more of a move that is done fairly quickly by the board when they feel that there is some sort of imminent threat posed by a doctor. I was told that the doctor will have a chance at some point to defend himself before the board, but that would likely happen over a series of hearings. It could take several weeks or even longer. Clarice?
Natalie Solis live tonight in Plano. Thank you.
Duntsch was able to issue some sort of appeal through a lawyer and said he didn't have the time to use drugs or drink, even if he wanted to, because he was too busy. He said he was a hard worker, and he even threatened to sue Dr. Kirby for slander. He claimed he was at the centre of a vast conspiracy to bilk money from the hospitals where he practiced. When asked why it had taken so long for the suspension to happen, the head of the medical board said at the time, "It's not uncommon for there to be complications in neurosurgery. None of us rush to judgment, that's not fair, and in the long run, it can come back to being correct. To suspend a physician's license, there has to be a pattern of patient injury. So that was ultimately what happened, but it took until June of 2013 to get that established," he added.
Can you explain then what happened during those surgeries, please, sir? I talked to a doctor who said that you were like a serial killer. Do you have a response?
Yes, I'll deal with that in the context of libel later when I've defended myself.
Are you planning to try to practice medicine again?
Yes.
For Doctors Henderson and Kirby, it wasn't good enough. Dr. Henderson said the word suspended implied he might be allowed back at some point, and they couldn't let that happen. Dr. Kirby, Dr. Henderson, and another doctor contacted the district attorney, arguing that Duntsch was a criminal. They got a meeting, but nothing happened. In December 2013, almost 2 years since Kelly Martin had died, the medical board permanently revoked Duntsch's license. Despite his huge salary, Duntsch was now in dire straits financially. He had to file for bankruptcy, owing more than $1 million, and leave Texas, moving in with his parents in Colorado. He would come back and forth to see his 2 young sons, but it appeared the relationship with his girlfriend Wendy had fallen apart too. A month after moving, he was pulled over by police in the early morning hours. He was driving on the wrong side of the road with 2 flat tyres. As soon as they spoke to him, the smell of alcohol was strong, and empty bottles littered the car floor. Duntsch was arrested for a DUI and ordered into rehab. In March 2014, police were called in again to a bank in Dallas after people saw a man with blood on his hands and face, banging on the doors and trying to get in. It was Duntsch. He was wearing his scrubs and was incoherent, saying something about his family being in danger. He was swiftly taken to a psychiatric hospital. After his father had sent him some money, he was caught in a Dallas Walmart, filling a cart with almost $1,000 of watches, sunglasses, computer equipment, and cologne. He bagged them up to hide them before picking out some clothes and putting them on in the dressing room. He then headed right for the front door but was stopped by security and arrested for shoplifting. His life was out of control, and the wheels were starting to come off. Later that year, Baylor Plano was told a lawsuit had been lodged against them by Ken Fennell and Lee Passmore, swiftly followed by Mary Eford and Barry Mergeloff. Baylor Plano described this as extremely frustrating and difficult, adding that a lot of what had been said about them was misleading, and that they never knowingly allowed one person to compromise the level of quality care they pride themselves on. Jeff Glidewell, still fighting to accept his life was now what it was, but still wanting justice, made a call to a judge with everything he knew about Duntsch. This would finally help bring the case back to the district attorney's attention and get the ball moving. We now meet someone else vital in bringing this case to a conclusion. Michelle Shughart, the assistant district attorney. The case instantly piqued her interest, as in her 13 years with the Dallas DA's office, she had never prosecuted a doctor. In fact, from looking at other cases like this, it seemed that no one had ever prosecuted a surgeon for what they had done in the operating room. It would become a case of firsts for many reasons. She began researching everything she could on Duntsch, and it was staggering just how much was out there about him.
Can you explain then what happened during those surgeries?
She issued 800 subpoenas and spoke to over 100 people in person. In July 2015, 46-year-old Christopher Duntsch was arrested on 5 aggravated assault charges, 1 count of injury to an elderly person, Mary Eford. He was also accused of maiming 3 patients and causing the deaths of at least 2.
Tonight with a North Texas doctor charged for what happened in his operating room during surgery. Dr. Christopher Duntsch is a neurosurgeon and now faces charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, his scalpel. Duntsch is accused of butchering patients and botching surgeries of 5 Dallas area patients who either died or are now scarred for life. News 8's Brett Shipp was among the first to expose these allegations, and you're joining us with the latest.
That's right, Shelley. We first revealed the allegations against Dr. Duntsch in 2013 of case after case of botched surgeries, of alleged drug abuse and reckless indifference toward his patients who will now try to help put him behind bars. Victims and their attorneys say Duntsch was building a resume of alleged botched surgeries of paralyzed patients and, in 2 cases, death. While Duntsch was operating on Lee Passmore of Frisco, an assisting surgeon had to intervene. Jim Gerards is Passmore's attorney.
Dr. Duntsch had to be physically restrained by the surgeon that was operating with him because that second surgeon recognized that Duntsch was doing things that were not explainable, that were extremely dangerous.
Other patients have similar stories. Duntsch's former roommate, Jerry Summers, will never walk again.
Hospital staff knew that Dr. Duntsch had a gallon jug of vodka under his desk, that a baggie of white powder had been found in his bathroom.
Duntsch remains behind bars tonight on $600,000 bond.
He was taken into custody and denied all the allegations.
What they're alleging, and none of it's true. It's easy defendable. None of these petitions, even for these people, they never went forward. They never litigated, they never deposed, never went to trial. I have nothing to hide.
He was officially charged and pleaded not guilty. In Texas, the charge of injury to an elderly person carries a potential life sentence, but there were only 4 months left before the statute of limitations ran out. This was the big charge they were pushing to take to trial, as, for various reasons, if they could obtain a conviction for this, it would be worth more in terms of years than any of the other charges. One lawyer said it's not worth an attorney's time and energy to take on a malpractice case. The outcome, sadly, would just not be worth it. The prosecution knew this was a tough case, but their goal was to get a sentence long enough to ensure he would never be able to practice medicine again. To the relief of the prosecution, Duntsch was criminally charged in the maiming of Mary Eford. And this was the charge that went to trial.
Former neurosurgeon who was once a rising star in his medical field is now in jail on felony charges. Fox 4's Natalie Solis tells us how the malpractice claims against him became a criminal investigation.
Christopher Duntsch on Facebook when he had a thriving medical practice. And Duntsch Tuesday, just a few years later, booked into the Dallas County Jail. James Gerards represents one of Duntsch's former patients who sued the former neurosurgeon in civil court after a botched surgery.
It is so rare for a district attorney to prosecute a physician.
Dallas police picked him up Tuesday afternoon on the assault charges near a Richardson motel.
Typically, when a physician is targeted for a criminal prosecution, the industry rallies around that physician. For that reason, it's a real gut check for a district attorney to indict a physician for something that he was doing professionally.
But Duntsch stands out.
This one is so egregious that the information just couldn't be controlled.
Well, since 2013, Duntsch has been back and forth between Dallas and Colorado, where he was put on probation for DWI. But it appears Duntsch does not have legal representation so far for these latest charges. Now, we did put in a request to do a jailhouse interview to get his side of the story. We have not gotten a response.
Well, we're hearing this trial could last several weeks. It actually presents a lot of interesting legal questions. Can a botched surgery rise to the level, be more than just malpractice? Can it rise to the level of a criminal act? And that's something this jury will have to answer.
Duntsch opted not to testify in his own defence. Despite the fact they were only focused on Mary's case, they still had a huge amount of people that were willing to testify against him to prove his negligence in the years before he even met Mary. Doctors Randall and Henderson took to the stand, as did Jerry via a video link from his home. Mary herself also testified.
What are we looking at here in State's Exhibit 4?
My back, the scar on my back. I could not move my feet and legs, and my thoughts was something is wrong. I'd never had pain like that before. It was just almost, it was a 10 plus. I said, he will never touch me again.
The prosecution said it was obvious he had intentionally, knowingly and recklessly harmed up to 15 of his patients, although we know there were many more people affected. Jeff Cheney woke up from his operation to find out that Duntsch had removed part of his spinal cord by mistake, paralysing the entire right side of his body. Jackie Troy found herself unable to talk as Duntsch had paralysed her vocal cords. Philip Mayfield paralysed from the neck down. Marshall Muse spiralled into addiction after relying on pain pills following his surgery, and Pam Trusty feels lucky to be alive. However, Duntsch's legal team claimed that he was not a criminal, just a lousy surgeon and a lazy person.
He didn't know he was risking anything. It was careless. It was wrong, but it's not to the level of criminal.
They said him committing malpractice was due to chaotic operating rooms in hospitals in Dallas, and as for the emails he wrote to his ex-girlfriend Kimberly saying he would become a killer, they said it was simply sarcasm taken badly.
The jury in the Dr. Christopher Duntsch case will hear closing statements tomorrow. Defense attorneys sought to portray him as an inexperienced, poorly trained surgeon.
Is it fair for Christopher Duntsch, who was enabled to do these surgeries, who couldn't have done it without the help of all of these big hospitals, all these other doctors, is it right for him to go away, to be thrown away, when all of them profited? All of them have blood on their hands.
The only way that this happens is that the entire system fails the patients. Again, there are multiple things that have to occur in order for us to be here.
The carnage he caused was not a mistake or an accident.
He did virtually everything wrong. So to be able to do that much wrong, I felt that he must have known at some point in time how to do it right. It was that egregious.
Did he follow the Hippocratic Oath?
Its major tenet, first do no harm, he certainly didn't.
Dr. Robert Henderson testified he was called in to try to correct Duntsch's surgery, calling Eford's case an atrocity and questioned Duntsch's qualifications.
I became concerned whether or not he was a physician and was a surgeon.
Duntsch's attorneys agree he made mistakes. They just say prosecutors can't prove it was knowing, reckless, or intentional.
Even his lead attorney said, you had people in walkers, you had people on crutches, you had people that could barely move, you had people that had lost loved ones, you had all sorts of things that had gone wrong. Before we even get to Mary, you can see that it's going downhill. I mean, it's going downhill fast. So why didn't he stop? Michelle asked. Because of greed, because he owed people a lot of money. He wanted to live the high life and a neurosurgeon makes big bucks. Why didn't he stop? Because he had no conscience. He doesn't care what he has left in his wake. In court, Duntsch was calm and collected. His lawyer later said he truly and honestly thought he was doing a good job, and this all seemed shocking to him. He said until the expert started speaking, it seemed he was clueless as to the damage he caused.
So this is not providing any stability at all. There's bone fragments just laying over the exposed dura here on the left side.
The jury took just 4 hours to return their verdicts.
When the jury unanimously find that Christopher Daniel guilty.
In July 2016, he was found guilty of 1 count of intentionally or knowingly causing serious bodily harm to an elderly individual. Duntsch's family begged for some mercy when it came to the sentencing. They described him as a bright little boy who had taken care of sick birds and loved dogs. They acknowledged his issues, but said everything he did came from a place of wanting to help people. His dad, Don, said,
he's been devastated. He has nothing. He's lost everything. He doesn't have his family. He doesn't have his career. He doesn't have his companies. He doesn't have his medical license. And I think what happened is that as things began to fall apart, the only thing he knew was to try harder.
Jury, having found the defendant, Christopher Daniel Duntsch, guilty of injury to an elderly individual as charged in the indictment, unanimously assessed his punishment and confinement in the Institutional Division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for life.
In February 2017, Christopher Duntsch was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 30 years.
6 o'clock, a former North Texas doctor learning that he will spend the rest of his life in prison.
And so we're overwhelmed. And this is my daughter, and this is a voice for Kelly, and we're so thankful, and hopefully we can move on with our life.
I'm just so grateful from the bottom of my heart. This will not bring my mother back, but it is some sense of justice.
This is what I wanted. This is what I waited 4.5 years for.
He believed that everyone else was just humans, and this was his playground, and he could build anything, sell anything, ruin anything, and he would not suffer the consequences.
We are so elated about the life sentence that has been handed down in this case today.
There have been other filings from other patients against Duntsch, but we hear from the district attorney's office tonight that they do not plan to seek any criminal charges from those cases at this point. As for Duntsch and his legal team, they did make it clear today that they plan to appeal.
He filed an appeal in 2018, but his conviction was upheld. He's not eligible for parole until 2045, when he will be 74 years old. This case set a huge precedent. It is the first time in the United States that a physician has been convicted of criminal charges for actions in the course of their medical work. In June 2023, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed a bill into law that would give the state's medical board additional ability to protect patients from potentially dangerous doctors. The bill, HB 1998, was introduced in response to an investigation that found at least 49 doctors were practicing in Texas, despite having their licenses revoked in other states. To think about how many people these doctors were treating is shocking. There was no record of these actions on the Texas Medical Board's physician profile pages, despite being required by law. The new law includes several provisions which will better enable the board to protect patients and boost transparency. These include some of the following. Lying on a medical license application will be a Class A misdemeanor. Doctors who have had their medical licenses revoked, restricted, or suspended in another state will not be allowed to practice in Texas. All doctors will be required to be fingerprinted as part of a criminal background check and be monitored monthly via the National Practitioner Data Bank. The 4 hospitals that employed Duntsch have ongoing civil cases against them as well. Sadly, not reporting these things is not uncommon. In 2011, a staggering 47% of hospitals did not report their restrictions or revocations of doctors' clinical privileges, leaving the doors wide open for the lack of paper trail to be taken advantage of. Questions had to be answered, and accountability had to be taken. It highlighted the systemic problems within the healthcare field, all the way to the top. The hospital officials, which allowed him to leave rather than firing him and having him investigated, issued a statement which read, "Our primary concern, as always, is with patients. Out of respect for the patients and families involved, and the privileged nature of a number of details, we must continue to limit our comments. There is nothing more important to us than serving our community through high-quality, trusted healthcare." Trying to comprehend the amount of damage and destruction that Christopher Duntsch has caused is impossible. Between May 2011 and June 2013, Duntsch performed surgery on 38 people. 32 of them were left with life-changing injuries, in some cases completely paralysed, and 2 had died. His case became quite a big part of mainstream media, with a hugely successful podcast being launched about it. And it was even made into a TV show on Peacock called Dr. Death.
Good morning, I'm Dr. Christopher Duntsch. Patient presented with severe back pain diagnosed as a herniated disc. It is important we are in and out with as little fanfare as possible.
It was an all-star cast, with Joshua Jackson playing Duntsch and Christian Slater playing Dr. Randall Kirby. And this brings us to the amazing doctors that helped put an end to his career. One has to wonder, if it wasn't for the perseverance of Dr. Kirby and Dr. Henderson, how much longer would Duntsch have continued? Tragically, a 3rd victim's life would be claimed when, in 2021, Jerry Summers, Duntsch's patient and once dear friend, died from an infection connected to his botched surgery. We trust that when we need them, people in Christopher Duntsch's position of authority, knowledge and power will look after us. They will care for us, they will make us better. We put our faith and trust in them, that they will turn things around even when the odds might seem stacked against us. We hope that we are in good and safe hands. For the families that were affected by the crimes of Christopher Duntsch, that trust will likely forever be broken. Kelly's husband, Don Martin, said, "My whole lifestyle has changed. Everything is different now. I look at life differently, totally differently. Life is too precious, too short. We can't take the little things for granted. We are just trying to make the best of each day." Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like to support our channel and help us to continue to make content, please don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. It helps us so much and we really appreciate it.